All right, guys, welcome to week 2. Today we're going to talk about buying policy and building your buy box. It's pretty much the same thing. When I say policy, I'm saying, what locations am I going to buy in, what price, what size, what age, what class, what cap rate, how much cash flow do I need? And then we're also going to talk about the $1,000,000 rule. So the idea for this part of the course is for you to be able to create a quote unquote buy box. And what that does is it keeps you focused in on what you're looking for, right? You can also tell other people what you're looking for. You can use this information to do your searches, which we'll get into in the next module. And you can actually have a disciplined approach towards looking at multifamily. You're not just like looking at every single thing that comes across your board and, oh my gosh, this looks really pretty. I really like this building. That's how people get lost and how they get spun out. And you really have to stay focused. So that's why a buy box is important. So let's jump right in. Number one, location. One of the biggest questions we always get is, should it be in my backyard? And the answer is yes, if your backyard is a good place to invest, right? So location is huge, you guys. And all these things we're going to talk about are also price dependent. I mean, obviously, you want the best location in the world, right? Who wouldn't? But can you afford it? And can you make it make sense? So remember that all these variables play on each other. So you have to kind of weigh them out. It's not like you're like, location is always most important and da 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 da. Like if you just said, no matter what, I have to have the best location, well, you better be willing to pay $100 million or whatever plus, right, for a great building, because obviously that's not realistic for someone starting out. So let's talk about, that being said, let's talk about location. Should it be in my backyard? If you have a location that is good in your backyard, then absolutely. So how do you tell if it's good? One of the biggest things is population, guys. You need to be over, and this is just a rule I use, but I would say at least 100,000 people. These smaller towns just create all types of problems, and I should have put something in here about population, but we'll just talk about it. You want to be in a population area of over 100,000 people, and possibly even bigger. A lot of these sub-metro areas are really nice for this because they've got a lot of people. They're also closer to a big city. Stuff like that's great. So, and then another thing that I'll mention about location is this is just my personal preference. I don't like to buy in blue states. And I'm talking a little bit political here, but blue versus red. The blue states, I'll give you an example. I owned a property in Norfolk, Virginia, and the lady decided to quit paying rent. It took me about 14 months to get her out, which ended up costing me, this was a single family house, but that ended up costing me just on that deal alone, like $16,000. And that was just because the policies there were not landlord friendly. As a matter of fact, they're tenant friendly. So the reason that I try to always buy and only look in red states is because they're landlord friendly, guys. We're the ones that are providing the housing. Like, we're the ones that need to be protected so that there is housing, and that's my opinion. So would I never ever buy in a blue state? I would, all these rules can be broken, but in general, I am only looking in red states. Let's see, what else can we say about location? It's always nicer to be in warm states. Now, I'm from Idaho, and I know that there's a lot of money to be made up there. There's a lot of money in Denver. There's a lot of money in some of these other areas that are north. But just in general, if I had my preference, I would choose a state that's warm because people tend to migrate south, right? So what ends up happening, I'll give you an example of the areas that I really like. I like Arizona. I like Texas. I like all the southern states. I like Arkansas. I like Florida. Everything in the Southwest I like, and also everything in the Southeast. Not everything, but most of them. So that's just kind of a general idea for me. So if you live in one of those places and you can invest in your backyard, it's obviously majorly advantageous to stay in your backyard, right? Because you can really know your area. You can know what parts of town are good, what parts of town are bad. And if you don't know that, you need to get good at that, even if you don't live there, right? So a lot of people are scared to invest outside of their own location. I personally am very used to it because I've done real estate nationwide for a long period of time. But you have to learn how to look at maps. You have to have people in the area. You have to learn the areas. You have to travel to the areas. And of course, you're going to be going to see these properties, so you definitely want to know the area. But does it have to be in your backyard? No, it doesn't. Okay, what makes a good location? We've talked about that. Is location everything? Um, Let me put it this way. If you have the best location, then nothing else matters. But other than that, is location everything? No. Obviously, it is very important, though. And then also, it's always a trade-off, right, for price. And also knowing like what class of asset you're buying, and we will talk about that a little bit as well. And then locations are also rated by, similar to, we're going to talk about what class of units, but locations can be rated just like units: A, B, C, D locations. So an A location is going to be, right next to like the stadium or whatever that makes where people want to be, like the really live hotspot, like walking to restaurants, and it just goes down from there. So location can be A, B, C, and D. And again, it's all price dependent. So there's a lot of moving parts here, guys. Just kind of, the more you can know about it, the better, and just realize that all of these things are going to kind of intermesh as well. So how should you pick your target location? You should pick it based on where you live. You should pick it based on all the variables that we just talked about, and then you should probably just pick either one area to focus in on or a couple of different areas. They could be regions or states. Maybe you just want to do Arizona and Florida, or maybe you just want to do, maybe you live in Memphis and you just want to focus in on Memphis. I think that would be just fine. So it depends on where you live. All right, let's move on. Okay, price. This is a big one. So what is my experience level is what you should be asking yourself. If you are just barely starting to buy deals, then do not go after a $20 million, $40 million, $60 million deal. The other thing to consider is, what is my team's experience level, right? Because as we get further into Multifamily Accelerator, we're going to be talking about how you network, how you build your team, and you need to know what your key principal or your sponsor can actually qualify for in terms of a loan, and we'll get more into that. But the bottom line here is, guys, that the sweet spot for newer people is between 3 and 10 million. And one way that you can waste a lot of people's times, including yours, your brokers, your partners, is by going after these huge buildings. And I'll just say, first of all, anything can happen, right? Like, you could go after a $50 million building on your first deal, and you could get it. Your odds are just way, way, way less. And what ends up happening is you end up spinning everybody out, and the broker gets upset. And keep in mind, on a $50 million building, if you have to come up with 40%, 40% of that, you've got to come up with 200. You've got to come up with a considerable amount of equity. Excuse me, I lost my train of thought there on the math. But you have to come up with a ton of equity, right? So if you don't have experience raising money, then it's just going to make it harder and harder. So on price, this is one of the biggest things I see people mess up on. Stick to 10 million and under, and I would say above 3 million because of the $1 million rule, which we'll talk about here shortly. Okay, size. In terms of units, size does matter. One of the biggest things with size we want to consider here, and why you don't want small deals, is because they're hard to manage. So the sweet spot for the number of units, guys, is around 70. And why do I say 70? No, it's not an exact number, but what happens at about 70 units is you can start to justify a full-time property manager. That's when you can actually pay maybe a $45,000 salary and have it make sense to have one person sit and manage that deal. Because what happens on the smaller deals is the property management is always an issue. And even though people are like, oh, I can get my 20 unit managed for 5% per 5% of whatever the income is, and sometimes that is the case, but in general, whoever's managing a smaller place like that for 5% is going to be it's just going to be a huge headache. So one of the biggest numbers in real estate that matters the most is the number of units. So the more units you can get, the better off you're going to be. But again, how big is too big? Like, obviously let me just buy 400 units then, right? So it comes down to, again, all of these factors work together. We've got to look at age, we've got to look at price, we've got to look at location. Now, if we could have a great location, a lot of units, 200 units at a great price, and it's not too old, like when you have all those things, that's a great deal. So all these things factor in. Not one of them stands above the others, but they all factor together. So What I would strive for, if you want me to simplify what's important for size, I would try to stay above at least 60, and if not 60, 70 units. Okay, so now let's talk about age. How old is too old? So newer is obviously better, but it's going to be more expensive. Again, it's the catch-22, right? So things to consider about age. CapEx. So how much have they fixed? Like if it's a super old place and it has galvanized piping and you're going to have to go in and redo all the plumbing, just know that. Or maybe they've already redone the plumbing. Or if it's a place that has an old boiler that's going to need to be replaced, you need to factor that in, or you need to know when it was done last. So a lot of times, one of the things that can make age okay is if a lot of those big, huge expenditures like roofs, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, if that stuff has already been replaced, well, then age is less of a big deal, right? It's not quite as big of a deal. But if it hasn't been replaced, it's going to have to be replaced, and you're going to have to figure that into your capital expenditure budget. So obviously newer is better, but when you start getting into old stuff that's pre-70s, it starts to get really expensive for CapEx, especially if nothing's been done on it. In the 80s is a good sweet spot for newer buyers. If you can stay in the late 70s, mid 80s, that's probably where your price allows you to be at. And obviously, the newer, the better. Okay, let's talk about the class. So A class is going to be like your, super nice, high rise, or maybe not high rise, but mid rise. Very nice apartments within walking distance to all the restaurants. B class is going to be, a little bit further out of town, maybe not out of town, but out of the center of town. And C class just starts to get worse. Maybe it's in town, but it's a crime-ridden area. And D is straight up heavy crime, lots of problems. So again, this is a variable of price and all the other factors. So obviously, the higher the class, the better, right? But if you're brand new and you're trying to buy between $3 and $10 million building and you're trying to get 60 plus units, you're probably not going to get an A class building. Now, if you can, great. But a B class is very good. So what a lot of people will try to do is they'll try to buy maybe like a C plus and turn it into a B. There are some other strategies that I'm not going to get into right now where you can actually go in and buy Ds and bring them up to Cs. That would have to be a whole nother separate course on its own. But obviously, the better the class, the better off you're going to be. And usually where you're going to fall is high C to low B for what we're starting out with. Okay, how much should you care about cap rates? Depends on the market, right? Interest rates effects on cap rate. Okay, this is a big one. And we're going to talk more about cap rate when we start doing our underwriting. But in some, when I say it depends on the market, when the market was hot and the rents were rising, people didn't care about cap rate. I mean, you saw people buying at like 2.8, 2.7 caps, which are really, really low. And now that it's slowed down and interest rates have risen, the thing that we're really focused on right now at the time of this recording is trying to get a cap rate that is equal to your interest rate, right? So right now interest rates are at about 6.5. So anything you buy that is a lower cap rate than the interest rate, that means that you're basically going to be making less money than you have to pay. So if you have a building that's a 4 cap and you have to pay 6% interest on it, it doesn't take a genius to see that that's going to put you upside down. And the only way that you can get out of something like that is by raising the rents. So you're basically relying on one strategy of being able to raise the rents. And if in the market we're in right now, the rents are actually falling. So that's not a good way to buy. So cap rate right now is more important than it ever has been just because of the high interest rates. So you want to be able to buy something that is, I would say, within equal to or very close to the current market interest rate. So right now, that's about 6.5. I will also mention it's a lagging indicator. So the brokers are always pushing this envelope. They're always trying to keep the cap rate super low because that gets more money in their pocket and more money in the seller's pocket. So they're always messing with the pro formas to try to get the cap rate super, super low, which basically brings up the price of the building. And right now we're seeing these interest rates climb, and the cap rates are still below the interest rates because the cap rates are lagging because the sales that have occurred in the past when the interest rates were lower. So basically it's always kind of behind. So you're always trying to fight with the broker to get that that lagging indicator to where it should be. Bottom line on cap rate is, if you can, try to have a cap rate that is at or above your interest rate. Okay, cash flow. So cash flow is super important because when you're buying these deals, you're usually going to have other investors. Sometimes you'll be syndicating, so you'll have what's called limited partners, and you need to be able to pay your partners, right? So you need to also be able to pay your mortgage. So what is cash flow? Cash flow is what's left over after you pay all of your expenses, you get your NOI, right? So that's your net operating income, and then you pay your mortgage, and whatever's left after that is the actual cash flow that you get to distribute. So the more cash flow a property has, the stronger it is, right? The easier it stands on the balance sheet, and the easier it is to operate because you have a surplus of cash coming in each month. And if it doesn't have cash flow, well, then you have to budget within your budget how you're going to pay those bills until you get the cash flow up by raising the rents or remodeling the units. So cash flow is very important. I mean, if you want me to throw a number at it, you want to have, I would say, at least 5% cash flow when you're buying the deal, not necessarily the pro forma. Another mistake that we'll get into a little bit more later is that people are always saying, well, I can get it up to this cash flow. Well, that's great, and maybe you can. Chances are it's going to be less than you think, by the way. But what's really important is that you actually look at it as it is right now. So don't try to make it all, well, these guys, look at this, so they're 300 under rent, I can totally raise that. If I raise it by 300, then it'll be like so much cash flow. Okay, great, maybe. But that's pro forma. We want to look at as is numbers. Very, very important for cash flow. Okay, last is the $1 million rule. So actually Grant Cardone is the one that came up with this, and I think he's a great teacher. I want to repeat this because it makes a lot of sense to me. So make the transaction worth doing. How much money do you want to make? I would argue that it's not worth doing unless you can make $1 million. I mean, it's just not. So let me give you an example. So if you have 50 units and you're able to raise the rents by $100 each times 12 months divided by, let's say it's a 5 cap, that's $1.2 million that you can add value to. So you just want to kind of be looking at, is there enough money here? And this kind of goes into play more with the smaller deals. Some of you are still going to be doing smaller than the 60, 70 units. But you want to make sure, and that's okay. If you want to do smaller deals, that's okay. You're just know you're going to have to deal with property management. It's going to be an issue. But just try to make sure that you're at least able to make $1 million on the deal when everything is said and done. So that's what the $1 million rule is. Okay, guys, that concludes completing your buy box. So what I want you to have from this, and again, this is no different than setting your purpose. Like, don't freak out and be like, oh my gosh, it's set in stone. But on the other hand, don't not do the exercise. You need to do the exercise. So now you need to know what your buying policy is and your territory. You need to know your location, age, class, cap rate, cash flow. And there's a couple I didn't put in this last slide, but you know what? You can go back and look at them and make sure you have your actual buy box figured out so you know what you're looking for, and that'll make it a lot easier so that when stuff comes into your inbox, which we're going to show you how to get deals coming into your inbox in the next module, when stuff starts coming into your inbox, you're going to know if it fits, and you're going to know what not to waste your time on. And that is the most important thing, is just to not waste your time on looking at every single deal. All right, guys, that's it for this video.